Hi everyone, I'm Jennifer from English with Jennifer. How often do you get to meet new people? I think when you have the opportunity to meet someone interesting, you should reach out and grab it. That's what I did. I recently had a conversation with Steve Kaufmann, a well-known polyglot. A polyglot is someone who is multilingual. They know multiple or many languages. Poly means many. I've always admired the abilities of people who speak different languages, but Steve actually knows more than just a few. I'll let you find out just how many in the interview. Steve also shares his thoughts on language learning, which I think you'll find helpful.
Steve, I'm so excited to meet with you today. Thank you for joining me.
I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Right. And I know a little bit about you, but I don't know if all of my viewers do. So I thought the very first question I'm going to ask is probably the question you get asked the most is, how many languages do you know?
Okay, so there are appearances, there's reality, and reality is that I can probably easily speak 10 or 12 languages.
That's amazing.
But there is another, say 10 or 8 languages that I have at various times put a great deal of effort into learning and even traveled to the country and used. But right now, if you said, let's have a conversation in Romanian, I would struggle. And so it's sort of on a gradual declining sort of level of proficiency.
But you have some knowledge of all those languages, which is absolutely amazing.
Yeah, and more than some language knowledge, like I have maybe like in Korean, I have 40,000 words the way we count them on Link. And it wouldn't take me long. If I were there for a day or two, I'd be quite operational. But I think it's important for people to remember that, language learning is not about perfection. So even in your second language, like the first language you're learning, which people learning English, that might be the first language, or maybe not, because many people say have several languages. But it's never about perfection. And every effort that we put into learning a language and discovering a language and learning about the language, it's all good. And I don't feel any particular obligation to maintain my languages or to demonstrate that I can do, X, Y, Z in the language. It's all good.
I think that's wonderful that you said that. And I also say, like, as a teacher, I know a lot about the English language and I know more because I've taught it for so long, but that doesn't mean that I know everything about the English language, and I still make my own mistakes. Teachers do make mistakes
Absolutely.
as well. So I'm glad that you said perfection is off the table for
Off
all
the
of us.
table.
Off the table. The next question is why? Because as I understand, like, you're not a professor, you're not, your specialty isn't linguistics. So what compelled you to learn all these languages? Like, who are you? Like, what is your background? What do you do?
All
And
right.
what compelled you to learn all these languages?
All right. So first of all, since you mentioned the subject of background, I notice now that the background behind me, which is supposed to be a bookshelf, is what I use when I make my videos. But since it's only a curtain, okay, therefore, in this angle, you can actually see the top of my bookshelf. All right. So I just mentioned that background is a fake bookshelf background. So my background is I was a Canadian diplomat for 7 years. And my first assignment was to go to Hong Kong to learn Mandarin Chinese.
Wow.
And just by the way, Hong Kong was not a Mandarin speaking environment. And yet I learned Mandarin there. And I always use that as an example that you don't need to be in the place where the language is spoken in order to learn the language. And in many cases, people who are where the language is spoken never manage to learn it. So it's an advantage to be where the language is spoken, but it's not a necessary condition, nor is it a guarantee that you're going to learn the language. Then I lived in Japan, and then I worked in the forest industry for more than 40 years. And along the way, combination of it was useful for me to know these languages. I realized that I could learn them and developed a method of learning them that worked. So I was motivated to learn more of them. Generally, the motivation was not, I want to one day speak 20 languages, but rather all of a sudden I became interested in Russian, or I became interested in the languages of the Middle East, which is what I'm doing right now, Persian and Arabic. And recently I've been doing some Turkish. It's more the interest And the realization that every language which we explore and discover, the process itself is rewarding.
Yes.
And of course, if eventually you're able to use the language in some way, reading, listening, speaking, that is also rewarding. But even the process is rewarding.
Yes, it is. It is. And it's an ongoing process that's never quite finished, is it? So it's
Right.
the journey that we enjoy, not so much trying
Yes.
to reach some destination. Well, that ties into another question that I had in my mind, because sometimes you travel to a country, sometimes you don't. I'm very glad that you made that point, that you don't have to live, for example, in an English-speaking country to learn to speak English. But it's usually that initial interest, like something about a culture that pushes you. I'm going to learn that language. So what is the connection between language and culture? Because you don't just say, oh, that looks like an interesting language, I'll learn it. It sounds like to me like there's something in the culture that's pulling you towards that language. Is that correct?
You know what? The motivate could be anything. Like,
Okay,
many people learn a language because their spouse or partner
true.
speaks that language, or maybe they have trouble communicating with their parents or grandparents, or want to visit the country that their ancestors came from, and they never really had much connection with it. In my case, for example, I was going to visit Crete, so I decided to learn Greek. I was going to visit Romania on business. I decided to learn Romanian. I think in many cases, there could be something else that triggers the interest. And then as we get into the language, we discover things there that continue to pull us into the language. There's an expression in French, l'appétit vient en mangeant. So as you start eating, the appetite grows. So very often, if I look at my Persian or Arabic, I had very little knowledge of, say, Persian culture. But, at Link, we have a collaborator who lives in Iran, and she created such a wide range of content, audio with text, about the history of Iran, about Iranian minorities in Iran, Iranian food, movie directors in Iran. And so it's actually, to some extent, yeah, I mean, sure, the culture. Like, I remember when I started into Russian, I watched a movie with English subtitles, and it took place in Russia in the 19th century. And so that was very motivating to me. I imagined this world of Russian, and same when I got into French. But in the case of Chinese, for example, I can't say that the Chinese culture dragged me into Chinese, but as I started learning Chinese, I discovered more and more of China's history and culture and literature and stuff. So I think it's not always the thing that brings us into the language, but if we can get interested in the culture, then we're going to have an easier time learning it. If we are resisting the culture, then it'll be more difficult.
That's a good way to express it. Don't resist, embrace. Yes. I think a lot of people relate to the idea of there's a trigger, and then you want to learn more, you start to learn, and that appetite grows, as you say. Desire is one thing, putting in the effort is another. So two questions about the adult learners. Some people argue, but it's so much harder as an adult to learn a language. What's your opinion on that?
Well, I think so. I see two questions there. First of all, the importance of culture is sort of, as an element of maintaining your interest, because when we learn a language, actually, the beginning part, in a way, is the easiest, because there are many early victories.
Yes.
You know nothing, and now you know something. You didn't understand anything, and now you understand something. However, all experienced language learners know that after a certain point, once we've learned the sort of high frequency vocabulary, and of course, frequency declines very, very quickly, now we have to learn a lot of low frequency vocabulary. And so therefore we have to do a lot of listening and reading. And often we have the impression that we're not improving. And that's where the interest in the material you're using, could be culture, history, sport, whatever. You have to be dealing with things that are of interest to you, because that will keep you going.
Yes.
Okay. And then I forget, there was a second part of your question.
Which I didn't voice yet.
Adults.
Yes, adults, basically, but you're
adults.
answering it. Yeah.
Okay, but so the adults, yes, if you take a 5-year-old and pluck them out of wherever they were and put them into a different language environment and throw them in together with a bunch of kids, they're going to speak the language very quickly. They're not inhibited. They hear people saying things, they say it wrong until they start saying it right. People don't correct them, and pretty soon they're functional in the language. Adults aren't able to do that because they're more inhibited, because they're not in there playing. Like, maybe if an adult were thrown in with a bunch of native speakers and had no other option but to try to use that language every day, they would learn more quickly. So to that extent, children, it's easier for children. And children, especially say under the age of 10, the brains are more flexible. There's still, the opportunity for some other language to take over. And the longer we stay with the one language, the more our brains become a little more rigid, in terms of focused on that one language. However, adults have other advantages. It could be the subject we brought up, which is an interest in the culture, for example. Adults have vocabulary in their own language. So obviously a 5-year-old has a limited vocabulary even in their own language.
True.
So an adult comes in with life experience and wide, vocabulary in their own language, which they can use to learn what the equivalent is in the new language. So adults have some advantages. I think adults, I can learn a language with the same writing system as English, and especially if there's a lot of common vocabulary, as even was the case with Romanian, I can learn those languages quite quickly. Not that I speak without an accent like a kid might do,
right?
But I can read stuff. I can maybe follow the news on television. I can do things after 6 months to a year that a child wouldn't be able to do.
True.
So I think there are advantages and disadvantages, but age is no obstacle. Age is no obstacle.
Very well said. I'm glad you said that. But then some adults argue, and you could relate to this, we're all such busy people, right? And we fight to find time for things. So what do you say to the busy adult who says, I'd love to, but it's just so hard to find the time to invest?
Sure. We all have to decide what our priorities are in life, right? So you have to be interested. You have to be motivated. You have to be motivated, and you have to find the time. Those are the two sort of ingredients for success: motivation and time. Fortunately, today, it's easier than it ever was, because I have on my iPhone, I have vast libraries of content, audio and text, in different languages. If I'm working on Persian, I carry all of my stuff on my iPhone. If I got 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there, I get up in the morning, I make breakfast, I listen to the language that I'm learning. I'm listening, I don't quite understand it all. Then I go and read it on LingQ. I look up words and phrases. I can find 20 minutes here, 10 minutes there. It has become easier, but it has always been, adults play sports, adults read books, adults play poker, adults find the time to do things that are important to them. Yes. So if learning a language is important to you, and the advantage again if you're going to play poker or play tennis, you have to set aside an hour or two to do that. Whereas with languages, you can do it while in the car driving, while sitting on the train, while cooking, while cooking. It depends what you're doing. Cooking an egg, maybe. So, but certainly cleaning up, you can do it. So, I think it's a matter of priorities, and it is easier to learn languages than it ever was before. And as an activity, it's easier to do than some of the other things that adults like to do in their free time.
Yes, the content there's so much out there, it's available. So that's not an excuse. As you said, prioritize, I agree. And it sounds like you work it into your day. You have to make it part of your routine, part of your life. And that goes back to what you said earlier. You don't have to be in the country where the language is spoken. It's up to you to access the content and work it into your day somehow. And you could even multitask, as you suggested. So besides working it into your day, you've moved from language to language, and I'm sure you've developed your methodology. Is there like a top tip or a top few tips that you could give to learners?
Well, first of all, I had a look at your channel, and you have some great videos on different aspects of English, and I presume most of your viewers are people learning English.
Yes, and some teachers too.
And some teachers. So I think the number one thing is to try to enjoy it.
Yes.
You can zoom in on different aspects of English. I mean, the tense system in English can drive you crazy. I'm sure there are tips that you provide. Like mine would always be simplify. Just use a simple
That's
past. Don't worry
nice.
about all this other, so there are things that you can do. However, if you do expose yourself to a lot of the language, you're going to start to acquire some language habits, subconsciously.
Mm,
And those things are going to stick with you better than anything that you deliberately learn.
mm.
And if you put yourself in front of a list of phrasal verbs and read through that list 3 or 4 times, you're actually not going to achieve very much. You're far better to encounter these phrasal verbs or different, tenses in different contexts, and the brain is going to figure out a lot on its own. And once you have a lot of that experience, then if you get an explanation or some help from your channel or elsewhere, it's going to refer to something that you have already experienced.
Yes.
So you have to give yourself as much natural, meaningful, enjoyable exposure to the language as you can. And with that, if you have that in place, all of the other helps, looking up a grammar thing, your teacher suggesting something, advice you might get on a YouTube channel, all of that is then going to be, it hits fertile ground because you have already, ingested so much input in the language. So input, to my mind, is extremely important and enjoyable input.
I agree. That's why I say happy studies. That's my catchphrase. I want it to be happy. It should not be like a chore
Absolutely.
and terrible. But
Yeah.
I also love the key word you said is exposure. And that goes back to
Mhm.
you making that a priority. Everyone, if we want to learn a language, it's increasing the exposure, which goes beyond a lesson with a teacher. You could hire the teacher, you could go to a YouTube channel, but exposure needs to come from various sources, right?
Absolutely.
One question I have is there was a brief time I have not traveled the path of a polyglot, but back in
Mhm.
college, there was a time I was studying Russian, and then I decided to take Japanese. So for like 2 years, I first would go to my Russian class, then I'd go to my Japanese class, and it would happen where they ask her a question, you say hi, duh, you're just throwing. Do you mix up languages?
Sure. It happens. I can, and the strangest language connections. Occasionally, the brain kind of short circuits something. It happens. It's like I also make mistakes in languages. I
Mhm.
forget things in languages. All of these things happen. And obviously, if I had only learned one other language, I would make fewer mistakes. I wouldn't confuse them. But it's just a condition of learning different languages. It's barely noticeable when you're communicating with someone. They hear a word that doesn't belong. They don't know quite what it is. It happens to be Persian and you're speaking Russian. I don't worry about it, but it does happen. And if you then, and typically it'll happen if I've been putting a lot of effort into Persian and then I'm trying to speak Korean, then the odd Persian word is going to jump in there. But if I continue with my Korean, then that won't happen. So it's one of these things that happens. It's part of the imperfect world of learning languages. Not really a big issue.
But your brain, I marvel at what your brain has been able to do. Do you think knowing all these languages has changed your mindset, your worldview?
Well, absolutely. To the extent that every language you learn is a kind of a door to that culture and those people.
Mm.
So people whose language they kind of come alive more. And typically, like right now with Persian and Turkish, I find myself interested in the history of Central Asia. And so I buy books on the subject, which I read in English because it's too difficult for me to read them in Persian, let's say. But it just drags you into that other world. And the more you know about different countries through the language or basically stimulated by the language, of course, you have a more complete picture of those people and those histories and those cultures. So it changes your worldview, definitely.
That's
But
wonderful.
it's not because I speak different languages. It's more that through the languages I've
Yes.
learned so much more. And you also appreciate the fact that in different languages you can have different sounds, you can have different ways of expressing the same thing. You can even have things that they say in that language that we don't say in some other language. So you become more aware of how many different ways there are of being human, let's put it that way.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I don't know if we have time for one final question.
Sure,
It's
absolutely.
a request. I'm not to put you on the spot, but I have a little bit of knowledge of some other languages to help me understand the challenges that my students face. The
Right.
only language that I've really pursued so that I can be conversational is Russian. And I thought if we just end with just a couple of lines in Russian, would you feel comfortable doing that?
Ну, конечно, мы можем
Хорошо.
говорить по-русски. Да.
And for everyone listening, I'll try to explain perhaps in the video description what we're saying. Я просто думала, что зрителям было бы интересно слушать, как мы с вами говорим на русском языке, хотя бы с ошибками, может быть, но
Да, конечно.
можно, потому что я лично считаю, что практика нужна, практика важна, но не обязательно это не так важно говорить с носителями языка. Это полезно, конечно, но чтобы говорить, надо говорить с людьми. И если человек говорит с другими людьми, которые тоже изучают язык, я считаю, что это полезно. Вы
Ну
согласны?
да, я согласен. Я думаю, что когда мы изучаем какой-либо язык, надо слушать, я предпочитаю слушать носителя.
М,
Да, потому что, хотя я говорю с ошибками, произношение не так, скажем, перфектно, но,
Совершенный, да.
все-таки это
Да.
модель. Да? Я
Мгм.
должен как можно, я забыл мой русский, там есть персидский, который на мой мозг мешает меня говорить по-русски. Но я думаю, больше всего на случаем английского языка.
Ага.
Много людей, большинство людей, которые говорят по-английски, не являются носителями английского.
Это
Для
правда.
этого надо понимать,
Мгм.
но если с вами говорить, я не знаю, что из России, из Китая, из Бразилии, надо им понимать. Поэтому я думаю, что понимание
Мгм.
английского, который говорят не носители, это важно.
Это
Но
важно.
в случае других языках не так важно. И
М,
говорить, да, я предпочитаю говорить с носителями,
мгм.
когда изучаю, потому что это не только носитель языка, это тоже на самом деле носители культуры.
Ну да, это правда.
И они, да, поэтому я предпочитаю. Но все равно говорить надо. Но больше всего, как вы знаете, я сосредоточусь на слышании чтения.
Мгм, мгм.
И когда я слушаю, я больше всего предпочитаю слушать носителей.
Thank you. Thank you. And
Окей.
just the way to conclude to that, I just say those who don't speak Russian is I do think it's wonderful to have clear models, but the opportunity to speak is there, especially for English, as Steve said, because it is such a
Yeah.
global language. There are people to practice with and not necessarily native speakers. And I'll just add, when I was studying Russian, we had a language pledge, and I was studying with other Americans. And while we were studying, we promised only to speak Russian with each other. And that's how I also got my daily practice, not just in the classroom with the teachers, but with my classmates. And I began to feel more confident and lose some of my shyness speaking with other learners. So,
One thing I would add, I think one has to be a little careful. Like in Japan, for example, Japanese people get together in their conversation classes, and it can reinforce incorrect usage
true,
and
true.
poor pronunciation. As you know, I've put a major emphasis on input. I don't believe you need to speak all that much, at least until you have a high level of comprehension. So to me, the number one goal is comprehension, vocabulary. And if you have those things, when you get the opportunity to speak, whether it be with a native speaker or a non-native speaker, you're going to be able to speak better and better. And eventually to speak well, you have to speak a lot. But in the case of English, English is quite different from most languages. I mean, Russian, of course, Russian is spoken to some extent in the former sort of Soviet sphere, although less so than it was. But in the case of English, you know, sometimes people say, well, should I learn English or should I learn American English? You know, you have to be able to understand Indian English,
Yes.
Singapore English,
Yes.
Brazilian English, French
Yes.
English. So in the case of English, it's very important to listen to English spoken by non-native speakers. I'm not so convinced that that's true of other languages, because I find it's always more motivating to listen to a native speaker. So to that extent, my content, all the languages that I learn, I don't, if I hear a non-native speaker, I turn them off. I want to hear the native speaker of Persian or of Arabic. But English is a bit of a separate case. You might find yourself in discussion with you know, somebody from Mexico, somebody from you know, Portugal, or wherever, China, Japan. You have to be able to understand what they're saying. So you have to develop that level of flexibility that you can understand all different kinds of English. And similarly, when people worry about, should I learn you know, Mexican Spanish or Spanish from Spain, you have to be able to understand them all. So I think when it comes to listening, you should have as broad a range as possible. And when it comes to sort of developing your own speaking ability, I think it's useful to focus in on native speakers.
Thank you so much. Steve Kaufmann, thank you so much for your time. And
Okay,
it was
I
a
enjoyed
pleasure meeting you.
Okay, same here. Thank you. Bye.
So what can you take away from this? I hope you remember what Steve said about trying to speak a language perfectly. Don't. Both Steve and I agreed perfection is off the table. Go easy on yourself. You can strive for a high degree of accuracy, but mistakes happen in communication. Also, you're never too old to learn. You need a genuine interest and a real desire. Prioritize language learning. Work it into your life. Look for ways to expose yourself to English. Remember, there are many resources out there. Steve's YouTube channel is one of them. I'll put the link in the video description. In my opinion, your fellow language learners are a resource as well. If you have a conversation partner, this is a way to gain practice and build confidence expressing yourself in English. I agree with Steve that you need to be able to understand English spoken by many different people. It's a global language. But I'll clarify and tell you that I personally feel there are very proficient non-native English speakers who can provide a good model. So you don't have to limit your search to native speakers, okay? Please remember to like and share the video if you found the interview useful. As always, thanks for watching and happy studies.
I'd like to say a special thank you to a kind-hearted patron. Yelena pledged $2 a month. Thank you. Follow me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon. And don't forget to subscribe here on YouTube. Turn on those notifications.